In the depths of winter, when the world had forgotten the warmth of summer, a lone figure moved through the lands of always winter. His sword, once bright as starlight, now dulled by blood and ice. Behind him, 11 companions lay buried beneath the eternal snow. Ahead, shapes moved in the mist, shapes that hungered for the warmth of living flesh. He was the last hero, and he was about to discover a truth that would reshape the very foundations of the world. But that moment lies ahead in our tale. Tonight, we journey to a time when the 7 kingdoms were nothing but wilderness and dream, when giants walked the earth and the children of the forest sang to the trees, when magic flowed like rivers through the land, and heroes were forged in the fires of impossible necessity. This is the age of heroes, not the sanitized songs sung in great halls, but the raw truth of how legends are born. The maesters tell us Brandon the Builder constructed Winterfell and the Wall through brilliant architecture. They speak of Land the Clever outwitting the Casterlies through cunning schemes, pretty stories, comfortable stories. But they never tell you why these heroes had no choice but to build these impossible fortresses. They never explain what was hunting them in the darkness. They never reveal the price that was paid by those who chose to stand between the light and the endless night. Tonight you will learn why the others appeared, not as some distant threat, but as a consequence, a weapon that turned upon its creators and nearly devoured the world. You will discover why Brandon the Builder knew exactly where the wall needed to stand, as if he could see into the very heart of winter itself. In the great castle of Winterfell, deep beneath the crypts where stone kings sleep with iron swords across their knees, there are chambers that go deeper still. Chambers where ancient promises echo in the stone. Promises made by Brandon the Builder, promises kept by every Stark who came after. What promises, you ask? But that would spoil the mystery. The age of heroes was not an age of glory. It was an age of choices, impossible choices made by ordinary people who became extraordinary because someone had to, because the alternative was the end of everything warm and living in the world. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Age of Heroes, the remarkable era that shaped everything we know about Westeros. The legendary figures who, despite impossible odds, managed to forge civilization from chaos and protect humanity during its darkest hour. From magical pacts with ancient powers to the building of impossible fortresses, their story is one of sacrifice, wisdom, and the birth of legends that still echo through the ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. 12,000 years before Aegon the Conqueror set foot on Westeros, the world was a very different place. Imagine, if you will, a land unmarked by human ambition. No roads carved between distant kingdoms, no castles crowned by ancient houses, no walls stretching across the northern horizon like a barrier between life and death. Instead, there were forests, endless primordial forests of oak and ash, of ironwood and sentinel trees, whose canopies had never known the bite of human axes. These woods stretched from the neck to the lands of always winter, broken only by rivers that ran wild and free, their waters unmarked by bridges, their banks unclaimed by any mortal lord. In these forests, weirwood trees grew in sacred groves, their bone-white bark and blood-red leaves creating sanctuaries where time moved differently, where the very air hummed with old magic, where faces had been carved into their trunks by hands far older and more patient than any human craftsman could claim to be. You, as we embark on this journey through legend and truth, stand now as a seeker of ancient wisdom, a chronicler drawn by whispers and fragments, by songs half-remembered and bloodlines that carry memories in their very bones. You have come to understand not just what happened during the Age of Heroes, but why it had to happen, why ordinary people were forced to become legends, and what price they paid for the privilege. Your guides in this quest are those who remember, the singers who preserved the old songs when writing was unknown, and memory was the only library bent with age. Their voices worn smooth by decades of recounting the same tales. They gather in the gods' woods and the ancient halls, speaking in the old tongue of times when the world was both more wonderful and more terrible than any maester's chronicle could convey. There is old Nan's great-grandmother, a woman so ancient that her memory seemed to stretch back to the very edges of the Age of Heroes itself. She speaks of Brandon the Builder as if she knew him personally, describing not the legendary figure of songs, but a man burdened by knowledge he never asked for, building not from ambition, but from desperate necessity. Beside her sits Torren the Red, a wildling storyteller whose ancestors never bent the knee to southern kings. His people kept the old stories pure, untainted by the comfortable lies that southern lords tell their children. He speaks of the others not as distant bogeymen, but as intimate enemies, known by their hunger and their terrible beauty. His words carry the weight of inherited fear, passed down through bloodlines that survived the long night by being too stubborn to die. From the Iron Islands comes Yara Blacktide, a salt wife, whose family claims descent from the Grey King himself. She carries with her a horn made from what she swears is a piece of Naga's rib, and when the wind blows through it, the sound it makes is nothing human. She knows the songs of the drowned lands, the continents that sank beneath the waves, when the children of the forest broke the world rather than let it be conquered. These are your companions in this quest for truth. Each carries a piece of the great puzzle that is the Age of Heroes. Each remembers what their particular bloodline was meant to remember, while forgetting what was meant to be forgotten. Only by bringing together their disparate knowledge can the full picture emerge. The Westeros they remember was not empty when the first men arrived. It was full of the children of the forest, those small, strange people with their nut-brown skin and golden eyes, their hands of 4 fingers, their lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades. They were old when the world was young, and they had shaped the land according to their needs and their nature. The children sang to the trees, and the trees listened. They carved faces into the weirwoods, not for decoration but for purpose, creating a vast network of watching eyes, a living surveillance system that spanned continents. Through these carved faces, they could see any threat approaching their sacred groves. Through the whisper of wind in leaves, they could communicate across vast distances instantaneously. They made the forests their fortress and the rivers their roads. They knew every dell and hollow, every deer path and wolf run. They understood the language of birds and the migration patterns of beasts. In their hands, bronze became something more than metal, taking edges that could cut through steel and holding them for centuries without dulling. But most importantly, the children understood magic, not as some mysterious force to be feared or worshipped, but as a tool to be used, a resource to be harvested, a power to be shaped according to will and need. They could make the earth tremble and the seas rise. They could call storms and dispel them. They could reach into the very essence of living things and change them, improve them, bend them to serve purposes their creators never intended. This was the world the first men entered when they crossed the narrow land bridge that connected Westeros to Essos. The Arm of Dawn, it was called in later ages, though in those days it had no name because there were no maps and no kingdoms to mark borders upon. The first men came in waves, not as a single conquering army, but as countless separate migrations spanning centuries. They brought with them bronze weapons and wheeled wagons, domestic horses and herds of cattle. They brought fire and iron, the knowledge of farming, and the ambition to remake the world according to human needs and human timescales. They also brought something else, something the children of the forest had never encountered before and did not know how to handle. They brought the concept of ownership, of claiming land not just for use but for possession, of cutting down sacred groves not from malice but from the simple human need to clear fields for planting. To the children, this was not just an invasion, it was a fundamental assault on the very nature of existence. The first men looked at a forest and saw lumber. They looked at a river and saw a border to be crossed. They looked at a hill and saw a place to build a fortress. Everything the children held sacred, the first men saw as raw material for human ambition. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had seen before or since. It was not just a conflict between two peoples, but between two completely different ways of understanding existence itself. The first men fought with bronze and courage and the inexorable pressure of human numbers. The children fought with magic and knowledge and the fury of a world defending itself against transformation. For thousands of years they bled each other white. The children used their power over nature itself, calling storms to wreck the first men's ships, earthquakes to swallow their settlements, floods to drown their armies. The first men responded by cutting down every weirwood they could find, burning the sacred groves, hunting the children through forests that no longer offered sanctuary. It was during this endless war that both sides made choices that would echo through every subsequent age. Choices born of desperation and necessity, and the terrible mathematics of extinction. The children, facing the annihilation of everything they held sacred, reached into the deepest mysteries of their magic and created something that had never existed before. Something that would eventually turn on its creators and threaten to devour not just the first men, but all life itself. But that revelation lies ahead in our tale. For now, as we stand at the very beginning of the Age of Heroes, we can only sense the shadows of what is to come. We can see the seeds being planted that will grow into legends. We can feel the weight of choices not yet made, destinies not yet embraced, prices not yet paid. The Age of Heroes was born from this conflict between the first men and the children of the forest, born from the moment when both sides realized that their war would either end in mutual annihilation or force them to discover what they were truly fighting for. The first clue came from a burial mound in the neck, where the soggy ground had preserved what fire and time could not. A bronze dagger, its blade inscribed with symbols that predated any known alphabet. The metal itself defied explanation. Bronze shouldn't hold an edge for 8,000 years, yet this weapon could still split a hair or cut through steel mail as if it was silk. The Crannog men who found it spoke in hushed whispers about the dreams that followed. Dreams of a great war fought not between men, but between the very forces that shaped the world. Dreams of trees that bled real blood when cut, of storms called down by desperate voices, of the earth itself rising up in fury against those who would wound it. Similar artifacts began surfacing across Westeros, as if the land itself was finally ready to reveal its secrets. In the crypts beneath Winterfell, a stone carving emerged from behind a collapsed wall. It showed a figure in crude armor, hands raised toward a sky filled with falling stars. But these weren't stars. They were too angular, too purposeful. They looked almost like frozen tears. The maesters dismissed these findings as curiosities from a primitive age. Stone Age peoples often worshipped celestial events. They explained, comets and meteor showers would naturally seem supernatural to cultures without understanding of astronomy. But you know better now, don't you? You've learned to recognize the signs of a deeper truth hiding beneath comfortable explanations. On Dragonstone, in caves carved from volcanic glass, fishermen discovered paintings that made their hands shake as they lit their torches. The images showed battles unlike anything in recorded history, not armies clashing with swords and shields, but elemental forces locked in combat. Fire against ice, life against death, and caught between them, small human figures building walls and towers with desperate haste. One painting showed a massive tree, its trunk thick as a castle tower, its branches reaching toward heaven. Carved faces covered every inch of its bark, thousands upon thousands of watching eyes. At its base, small figures knelt in supplication, offering up what looked like drops of their own blood. The tree's roots stretched deep into the earth, but at their deepest point, something waited in the darkness. Something with blue eyes and reaching hands. The children of the forest had been trying to tell their story all along, hidden in cave paintings and carved stones, in burial goods and ritual sites. They had left a record of what happened during those forgotten years, when the world balanced on the edge of annihilation. But their language was not one of words, it was one of symbols and blood, of sacred groves and ancient pacts written in elements that transcended human understanding. In the Iron Islands, beneath the bones of what the Grey King claimed was the sea dragon Naga, excavators found chambers filled with salt water that never evaporated. The water glowed with a faint phosphorescence, and those who touched it reported visions of a time when the seas covered lands that now stood high and dry. They saw islands sinking beneath waves called up by magic, saw continents breaking apart like pottery thrown against stone. The arm of dawn hadn't simply eroded away over millennia, as the maesters taught. It had been deliberately destroyed. The children of the forest had shattered it with the same power they used to flood the neck, hoping to trap the first men on their island continent before they could spread their axes and fire across all of Westeros. The plan had failed, but the scars remained in the very geography of the world. These discoveries painted a picture that traditional histories could not account for. The first men hadn't simply migrated across a land bridge and gradually displaced the native inhabitants through superior numbers and technology. They had fought a war of extermination against beings who could reshape the world itself with thought and will and sacrifice. But why had such a war been necessary? Both peoples could have shared the vast continent. The children needed the deep forests and sacred groves, while humans preferred open lands suitable for farming and herding. There should have been room for both ways of life, both visions of what the world could become. The answer lay in competing understandings of time itself. Humans lived brief lives, 70 or 80 years if they were fortunate. They thought in terms of seasons and generations, of immediate needs and short-term goals. If winter came hard, they cut down trees for firewood. If the harvest failed, they cleared new fields from the forest. If enemies threatened, they built walls and towers as quickly as possible. The children of the forest lived for centuries. They thought in terms of ages and eons, of consequences that would unfold over thousands of years. When they saw humans cutting weirwood trees, they didn't just see the destruction of individual plants. They saw the severing of a communications network that had taken millennia to establish. They saw the death of witnesses who had watched over the land since the dawn of time. More importantly, they understood something about the world's balance that humans could not grasp. The weirwood trees weren't just sacred to them, they were necessary. They served a function that went beyond religion or sentiment. They were anchors, holding something back that should never be released. Every tree that fell weakened those bonds, brought the world closer to a catastrophe that would consume both peoples. The children tried to communicate this danger to the first men. But how do you explain concepts of deep time and cosmic balance to a species that measures success in harvests and tribal conquests? How do you make someone understand that their immediate survival might doom everyone who comes after them? The war escalated because neither side could afford to lose. The first men fought for land and livelihood, for the right to build homes and raise families in a world that seemed determined to resist their every effort. The children fought for the continuation of existence itself, for patterns of life and magic that predated human civilization by eons. Both sides made choices they would later regret. The first men began targeting weirwood groves specifically, understanding that these trees held special meaning for their enemies. They couldn't know that each fallen tree brought the world closer to disaster, that the carved faces in the bark had been watching for threats far greater than any human army. The children, driven to desperation by the systematic destruction of everything they held sacred, reached into magic they had sworn never to touch. They delved into powers that required not just skill to wield, but wisdom to control. Powers that demanded a price in blood and soul and the fundamental nature of reality itself. In a cave beneath Blood Raven's tree, far beyond the wall in lands where summer never comes, there are paintings that show what happened next. Crude figures gathered around a weirwood tree, their hands pressed against its bark, their life force flowing into its roots. And from that sacrifice, something new stepped forth into the world. Something that had never existed before, something beautiful and terrible and utterly beyond any mortal control. The children of the forest created the others not as servants but as saviors. They were meant to be the ultimate guardians of the natural world, immune to the weapons and fire that made humans so dangerous, capable of ending the war through sheer, overwhelming force. They would drive the invaders back across the narrow sea, and the world would return to the ancient balance that had maintained it since the dawn of time. But creation, even magical creation, never unfolds exactly as planned. The others possessed their own will, their own understanding of what salvation meant, and their definition differed significantly from what their creators had intended. This is how legends begin. Not with heroic declarations or noble intentions, but with desperate choices made by people who see no other option. Every great house in Westeros traces its bloodline back to someone who faced an impossible situation and chose to act rather than surrender. The consequences of those choices echo still through every castle, every crown, every oath sworn in the name of honor and duty. Accepting this quest means abandoning comfortable certainties for difficult truths. The maesters of the Citadel have spent centuries crafting a version of history that helps people sleep peacefully at night. Their chronicles speak of natural disasters and gradual cultural changes, of reasonable conflicts with understandable resolutions. They tell us the Age of Heroes was called such because it produced great men who accomplished great deeds through great effort. But you know better now. You understand that heroes aren't born from ambition or glory-seeking. They emerge from moments when ordinary people must choose between personal safety and collective survival, when someone must step forward into darkness because no one else will, or can, or dares. Your companions on this journey understand the weight of inherited memory. Old Nan's great-grandmother carries stories passed down through generations of women who kept the hearthfires burning, while men rode off to war. Her tales speak of winters that lasted not months but years, of settlements that went silent overnight, of children born during the long night who never saw sunlight until they had children of their own. She remembers when houses still left offerings at the base of weirwood trees, not from religious devotion, but from practiced caution. Her ancestors understood that some things in the world were older and more powerful than human kingdoms, and wisdom lay in acknowledging that power rather than challenging it. They knew that the carved faces in the bark were not decorative, they were watchful. Torren the Red brings different knowledge to your quest. His wildling ancestors never bent the knee to southern kings because they never forgot what lay beyond the wall. They maintained traditions that the Seven Kingdoms abandoned as civilization advanced. They still knew how to read the signs in animal behavior, how to interpret the aurora dancing across winter skies, how to recognize when the very air itself carried warnings of approaching danger. He speaks of the old compact between his people and the Watch, agreements made not on parchment but in blood and necessity. The wildlings would avoid certain passes during certain seasons, would stay away from ruins that should remain undisturbed, would never venture alone into the lands of always winter during the deepest part of winter. In exchange, the Night's Watch would maintain barriers that protected both sides of the wall from things that belonged to neither. These weren't superstitions or primitive fears. They were practical survival strategies developed through hard experience with realities that southern lords preferred to forget. The free folk remembered because forgetting meant death. The kneelers could afford to develop more refined theories about the nature of existence because the wildlings stood between them and the consequences of ignorance. Yara Blacktide adds her own perspective to your understanding. Her Salt Wife ancestors kept records written in the old tongue on scales taken from sea creatures that no longer existed. These records spoke of a time when the ocean levels were different, when islands now submerged beneath the waves supported thriving communities, when the boundaries between land and sea shifted with the will of those who understood the deeper currents. The Ironborn developed their culture of reaving, not from simple greed or warrior tradition, but from practical necessity. When the hammer of the waters sank their ancestral lands, her people learned to take what they needed from those who still had stable ground beneath their feet. The sea itself became unreliable, prone to sudden storms and impossible tides that could swallow entire fleets without warning. Yet even in their adaptation to loss and instability, the Iron Islands maintained connections to the old powers. The Grey King's Hall, carved from the bones of a sea dragon, wasn't built as a monument to conquest. It was constructed as a sanctuary, a place where the compact between his people and the drowned lands could be maintained even as the world changed around them. Together, your companions represent the scattered fragments of a larger truth. Each culture, each bloodline, each family tradition preserves pieces of knowledge that were once unified. The children of the forest, the first men, even the others themselves were part of a system that maintained balance through careful attention to forces beyond immediate human understanding. The breaking of that system created the need for heroes. When the ancient compact failed, when magic became unreliable, and the natural world turned hostile, survival required individuals capable of bridging different ways of understanding reality. Heroes weren't those who conquered their enemies, but those who found ways to restore balance when all the old certainties crumbled. Brandon the Builder succeeded not because he was a great architect or military leader, but because he understood how to work with powers that others feared or ignored. He incorporated children's magic into human engineering, created structures that served multiple purposes across different scales of time, built bridges between ways of life that seemed completely incompatible. The wall wasn't just a barrier against invasion, it was a statement of intention, a promise made in stone and ice and ancient sorcery that some boundaries would be maintained regardless of the cost. But building it required cooperation between former enemies, required humans to accept magical assistance they didn't fully understand, required the children to trust their most sacred knowledge to people who had recently been trying to exterminate them. Similar cooperation shaped the construction of other great strongholds during the Age of Heroes. Storm's End incorporated weather magic that kept the fortress standing against supernatural storms called down by angry gods. Casterly Rock was hollowed out through techniques that combined human engineering with earth magic borrowed from the children. The Hightower was built on foundations that connected to underground networks of cave systems that stretched beneath the sea. Each of these achievements required its builders to move beyond the limitations of purely human knowledge. The heroes of this age weren't those who rejected magic, but those who learned to work with it safely. They became bridges between different forms of power, translators between languages of stone and steel and sorcery. This is why their bloodlines remained important long after the magic faded from the world. Each great house carried genetic memory of how to work with forces beyond normal human perception. Some retained the ability to see through the eyes of animals, others could sense changes in weather patterns days before they manifested, Still others maintained connections to the weirwood network that allowed them to receive warnings or guidance during critical moments. These abilities weren't superpowers or divine gifts. They were practical adaptations developed through generations of cooperation with magical forces. Just as some families developed resistance to certain diseases through repeated exposure, the heroic bloodlines developed sensitivity to supernatural dangers through necessity and careful breeding with those who carried the right genetic markers. The journey you've chosen requires understanding how these different forms of knowledge fit together. Why certain families ended up ruling specific regions, why particular castles were built in seemingly impossible locations, why oaths sworn during the Age of Heroes continue to bind their descendants thousands of years later. Most importantly, you need to understand why the system broke down in the first place, and whether the conditions that created the need for heroes might return. The others didn't disappear. The magic didn't simply fade away. The fundamental forces that shaped the Age of Heroes remain active beneath the surface of ordinary political life, waiting for the right circumstances to reassert their influence over human affairs. The war between the first men and the children of the forest began not with armies clashing on battlefields, but with a single axe striking the bark of a weirwood tree. That first cut, made by a nameless settler clearing land for his family's farm, sent ripples through a network of consciousness that spanned continents. Every carved face in every sacred grove felt that wound as if it had been struck directly. What the first men couldn't understand was that they weren't simply cutting down trees. The weirwood served as neurons in a vast organic intelligence that had been growing and learning for thousands of years. Each tree was both individual organism and integral part of a larger mind, one that processed information across scales of time and space that humans couldn't comprehend. The children had spent millennia cultivating this network, carefully placing each grove to create optimal communication between distant regions. They could send messages from the wall to dawn in hours rather than months, coordinate responses to threats before they fully manifested, maintain awareness of changes in weather patterns or animal migrations that might affect communities hundreds of miles apart. More than communication, the weirwood network served as a monitoring system for forces that posed existential threats to all life. The trees watched for signs of the deep cold that came from beyond the edge of the world, listened for the whispers of hungry things that dwelt in the spaces between winter and death, felt the trembles in the earth that preceded the stirring of ancient powers that should remain sleeping. When the first men began their systematic destruction of the sacred groves, they weren't just attacking the children's religion or culture. They were dismantling a continental defense system that had protected all life from threats far greater than any human conflict. Each fallen tree created a blind spot in that network, a gap through which dangers could approach undetected. The children tried to explain this to the invaders, but how do you communicate concepts of deep ecology and cosmic balance to people whose entire worldview centers on immediate survival needs? The first men saw fertile land being wasted on unproductive forest. They saw strategic resources being hoarded by strange creatures who contributed nothing to human welfare. They saw obstacles to progress that needed to be cleared away so civilization could advance. The cultural differences went deeper than competing claims to territory. The first men understood time in linear terms. Past events were finished. Present needs required immediate attention. Future consequences could be dealt with when they arose. This perspective made them excellent at rapid adaptation and innovative problem-solving, but blind to patterns that unfolded across centuries or millennia. The children experienced time as a vast spiral, where past and future influenced each other through connections that transcended simple causation. They could sense how actions taken in the present would affect events generations hence, could feel the weight of ancient decisions still shaping current circumstances. This perception made them wise guardians of long-term stability, but poor at responding to immediate crises that required rapid change. Both approaches to existence had value. and in a perfect world they might have complemented each other. Human adaptability could have helped the children respond more effectively to changing conditions, while the children's long perspective could have helped humans avoid decisions with catastrophic future consequences. But the world wasn't perfect, and fear on both sides prevented the cooperation that might have saved everyone. The war escalated through a series of misunderstandings and overreactions that pushed both peoples past the point where peaceful resolution remained possible. The first men, seeing their settlements attacked by what seemed like the forest itself, began targeting rearwood groves specifically, believing they were destroying the source of the children's power. The children, watching their sacred network collapse tree by tree, reached deeper into magics they had previously used only in the most desperate circumstances. Archaeological evidence of this conflict can still be found across Westeros, though you need to know how to read the signs. Certain stone circles mark battlefields where the earth itself rose up to swallow human armies. Peculiar patterns in river courses show where the children redirected waterways to flood first men settlements. Unusual mineral deposits indicate places where supernatural fires burned so hot they fused sand into glass. The most dramatic magical intervention came when the children used the Hammer of the Waters to shatter the Arm of Dawn, hoping to trap the remaining first men on their side of the narrow sea and prevent further waves of migration. This working required the sacrifice of an entire generation of their most powerful green seers, individuals who poured their life force into reshaping geography on a continental scale. But the plan failed. Enough first men had already crossed to establish sustainable populations, and their bronze weapons proved devastatingly effective against children who had never faced metal tools designed specifically for warfare. Worse, the magical energies unleashed in breaking the land bridge had unintended consequences, weakening barriers that held back older and more dangerous threats. In the deep caves beneath the Isle of Faces, paintings created during this period show the children's growing desperation. Early images depict them as confident guardians of the natural world, directing storms and earthquakes against human invaders with the casual authority of gardeners pruning overgrown hedges. Later paintings show them gathered in smaller and smaller groups, their faces marked by exhaustion and fear. The final images from this period are the most disturbing. They show children gathered around a massive weirwood tree, its trunk carved with thousands of faces, its roots extending deep into the earth where something vast and dark waited to be awakened. The children in these paintings are cutting their own palms with obsidian knives, allowing their blood to flow into channels carved in the tree's roots. These weren't ritual sacrifices in the traditional sense. They were willing transformations, children who chose to merge their consciousness with something that had been sleeping since the world was young. They believed they were creating guardians powerful enough to restore the balance between human ambition and natural order, beings immune to bronze weapons and fire, who could end the war through overwhelming force. The magic they used was older than their own civilization. Techniques preserved from the Dawn Age, when the world was still forming its final shape. They reached into the fundamental forces that shaped winter itself, drew power from the spaces between life and death, channeled energies that existed beyond the normal flow of time and causation. What emerged from their sacrifice was indeed powerful enough to end the war between first men and children. But like all acts of creation, this one produced results that differed significantly from the creator's intentions. The others possessed their own will, their own understanding of what balance meant, their own vision of how the world should be ordered. They saw life itself as the problem. All the conflict, all the suffering, all the endless struggle between different forms of existence could be resolved through the simple application of eternal stillness. No more competition for resources, no more miscommunication between species, no more painful choices between competing needs and values. Just perfect, peaceful quiet that would last until the stars burned out and the universe itself grew cold. The children realized their mistake too late. The guardians they had created to protect the natural world were now committed to ending all natural processes. The war that had begun with humans cutting down trees would end with the elimination of everything warm, living, and growing on the planet. This was the crisis that created the Age of Heroes, not a time of glorious battles and noble victories, but a desperate scramble to contain a threat that neither the children nor the first men could face alone. Survival required cooperation between peoples who had been trying to exterminate each other, required the development of new weapons and new tactics for fighting an enemy that could not be reasoned with, bribed, or frightened. Most importantly, it required individuals willing to pay prices that no sane person would consider acceptable. Heroes weren't those who achieved great victories, but those who chose to sacrifice everything they valued to give everyone else a chance to see another dawn. For generations, scholars have accepted a convenient explanation for how the war between the first men and the children of the forest came to an end. The Pact of the Isle of Faces, they tell us, was a reasonable diplomatic solution to a territorial dispute. The children would keep their deep woods and sacred groves, while the first men could claim the open lands for farming and settlement, a fair division of resources that allowed both peoples to prosper according to their nature. This explanation satisfies our modern desire for rational solutions to complex problems. It suggests that even ancient peoples could set aside their differences through negotiation and compromise. The maesters point to the Isle of Faces as proof, that small island in the middle of God's Eye where weirwood trees still grow and carved faces still watch from their ancient bark. But spend time studying the archaeological evidence and troubling questions begin to emerge. Why would the children, who possessed magic powerful enough to shatter continents, suddenly agree to surrender the vast majority of their ancestral lands to invaders armed with primitive bronze weapons? Why would the first men, who had crossed an ocean specifically to claim new territory, accept restrictions that left them crowded into the least desirable regions of Westeros? More puzzling still, why does the pact coincide so precisely with the first recorded appearances of something the ancient texts call the Cold Ones, or White Shadows, in the far north? If this was simply a peace treaty between two peoples, why do the stories from this period speak of new threats emerging from the lands of always winter, of settlements going silent during the deepest part of winter, of rangers who ventured too far north, returning with tales of blue-eyed figures moving through blizzards that never seem to end? Old Nan's great-grandmother knows the truth hidden beneath comfortable explanations. Her bloodline carries memories of women who lived through the transition from war to an uneasy alliance, who witnessed the signing of the pact, not as a celebration but as a funeral for the world they had known. These women spoke of children who wept as they carved their names into the agreement, of first men chieftains who looked constantly over their shoulders toward the northern horizon. The real pact wasn't a division of territory. It was a mutual defense agreement against something that threatened both peoples with extinction. The children hadn't surrendered their lands voluntarily. They had been forced to seek human allies because their greatest magical working had gone catastrophically wrong, creating enemies too powerful for either people to face alone. Thorin the Red preserves different fragments of this truth through wildling oral traditions that were never sanitized by southern maesters. His ancestors maintained detailed knowledge of the seasons and weather patterns in the far north, information that proved their people had been monitoring conditions beyond the wall for thousands of years. They knew which winters brought only cold and snow, and which brought something else, something that hunted. According to these preserved accounts, the pact included provisions never recorded in official histories. The children agreed to share certain magical techniques with human allies, knowledge of how to forge weapons from dragonglass and rare metals, how to create barriers that would hold back supernatural threats, how to recognize the signs that preceded incursions from the deep north. In exchange, the first men committed their descendants to maintaining these defenses regardless of the cost. Certain bloodlines would be bound by oaths that transcended individual choice, required to serve as guardians against threats that most people would never see or understand. The price of survival was eternal vigilance, maintained by families who would pass the burden from generation to generation until the world itself ended. Yara Blackton adds her own perspective to this emerging picture. The Ironborn traditions speak of a great change in the sea itself during this period, of currents that shifted overnight and tides that followed no natural pattern. Her ancestors reported sightings of things moving beneath the waves, pale shapes that glided through the deep water without disturbing the surface, leaving trails of ice in water that should have been too warm to freeze. The Iron Islands became a refuge during this time, not because they were particularly defensible, but because salt water seemed to provide protection against certain supernatural threats. The Grey King's Hall, carved from the bones of a sea dragon, incorporated defensive features that had nothing to do with human enemies. The arrangements of the ribs created channels that directed wind and water in specific patterns, patterns that disrupted the movement of things that traveled on currents of cold rather than air. These scattered fragments of evidence paint a very different picture of the pact than the one preserved in official chronicles. This wasn't a peace treaty between equals, but a desperate alliance between two peoples who had inadvertently unleashed something beyond their power to control. The territorial arrangements were secondary to the primary purpose of the agreement, which was the establishment of a continental defense system against threats from beyond the known world. The Isle of Faces became the headquarters for this joint operation, a place where children and first men could meet regularly to coordinate their response to supernatural incursions. The weirwood trees served not just as witnesses to the agreement, but as communication nodes in a network that stretched from the wall to dawn, allowing rapid transmission of warnings about emerging threats. But even this alliance might not have been sufficient if the crisis had continued to escalate. The others weren't simply another enemy to be fought with conventional weapons and tactics. They represented a fundamental challenge to the nature of existence itself, beings whose very presence changed the rules that governed life and death, heat and cold, permanence and change. What saved both peoples wasn't military victory or diplomatic skill, but the emergence of individuals capable of bridging the gap between human determination and magical power. Heroes who could work with forces they didn't fully understand, who could make choices that seemed impossible but proved necessary, who could pay prices that no reasonable person would consider acceptable. The maesters present these figures as legendary warriors who won great battles against overwhelming odds. But the truth preserved in the bloodlines of their descendants tells a different story. These weren't conquerors or champions in the traditional sense. They were translators, individuals who could communicate between different forms of consciousness, who understood how to combine human innovation with magical wisdom. Brandon the Builder didn't construct the wall through superior engineering techniques. He built it by learning to work with the same forces that children had used to reshape continents, incorporating their magic into human architecture in ways that created something entirely new. The wall wasn't just a barrier against invasion. It was a statement written in ice and stone and ancient sorcery that some boundaries would be maintained regardless of the cost. Similar cooperation shaped the construction of other great strongholds during this period. Each represented not just human ambition, but successful collaboration between different forms of knowledge and power. The heroes of the age weren't those who conquered their enemies, but those who found ways to work with forces that others feared or rejected. This understanding changes everything about how we interpret the legends that followed. The great deeds attributed to these figures weren't demonstrations of individual prowess, but achievements made possible through partnerships that transcended the normal boundaries between species, between natural and supernatural, between the living and whatever lay beyond death itself. 8,000 years before Aegon's conquest, the seasons themselves began to fail. What had once been predictable cycles of warmth and cold, growth and rest, became increasingly erratic. Summers that should have lasted years ended abruptly in killing frosts. Winters arrived early and stayed late, bringing snow that refused to melt even under direct sunlight. The very rhythm of life that both the children of the forest and the first men had depended upon for millennia started breaking down. This wasn't simply climate change, as we might understand it today. The alterations in weather patterns defied natural explanation, following no logic that human knowledge or children's magic could predict or counter. Storms appeared from clear skies and dissipated without warning. Rivers froze solid in the middle of summer, then thawed during blizzards that should have turned them to ice. The aurora borealis, normally visible only during the deepest nights of winter, began dancing across southern skies in patterns that hurt to look upon directly. The rangers and scouts who ventured into the northern reaches brought back reports that grew increasingly disturbing as the seasons continued their decline. Entire forests stood leafless and lifeless, their trees neither dead nor alive, but suspended in some state between the two. Animals fled southward in vast migrations that ignored their natural territories and feeding patterns, prey species and predators traveling together in desperate herds that stretched for miles. Most troubling of all were the silences. Regions that had once teemed with the sounds of living creatures now lay under a quiet so profound it seemed to press against the ears like physical weight. No bird songs, no insect hum, no whisper of wind through branches, just emptiness that felt hungry, that seemed to devour sound itself and leave behind an absence more disturbing than any noise. The wildling communities that lived closest to these affected areas developed new survival techniques born from harsh necessity. They learned to travel only during daylight hours, to never venture alone into regions where the silence had taken hold, to read the behavior of animals as early warning systems for supernatural dangers. Their shamans, men and women who maintained connections to the old spirits of ice and snow, began reporting dreams that weren't dreams, visions of pale figures moving through landscapes where winter never ended. These weren't metaphorical or symbolic experiences. The shamans could describe specific geographical features, could draw maps of valleys and mountain passes they had never physically visited, could predict changes in weather patterns days before they manifested in the material world. Something was showing them these places, allowing them to witness events happening hundreds of miles away in regions where no living person dared to travel. The children of the forest found their own magical abilities changing in response to the shifting seasons. Greensight, their primary method of communication and surveillance, became increasingly unreliable in the northern regions. The weirwood network that had once connected them across vast distances began developing blind spots, areas where the carved faces fell silent and the trees themselves seemed to withdraw into some deep hibernation that no spring could wake them from. More disturbing still, some greenseers began receiving visions that came from outside their established network. Images that arrived without being consciously summoned, scenes of places that existed beyond the normal boundaries of the world. They saw vast caverns carved from ice that never melted, halls where figures in crystal armor held council in languages that predated human speech, armies that marched without leaving footprints and fought battles that left no bodies behind. These visions shared certain common elements that appeared regardless of which greenseer received them. All showed the same pale blue light that seemed to drain warmth from whatever it touched. All featured the same impossible geometries, spaces that folded in on themselves in ways that defied normal understanding of how distance and direction functioned. All contained the same sense of vast intelligence, a consciousness that operated according to principles entirely alien to both human and children's thinking. The political implications of these changes began affecting both peoples in ways that went beyond simple survival challenges. Among the first men, tribal alliances that had endured for generations started fracturing as resources became scarce and traditional territories proved no longer viable. Clans that had shared hunting grounds for centuries began fighting over access to regions that still supported normal plant and animal life. Leadership structures also adapted to meet new challenges. War chiefs selected for their prowess in battle against human enemies found themselves inadequate for dealing with threats that couldn't be fought through conventional means. New forms of authority emerged among those who demonstrated ability to navigate supernatural dangers, individuals who combined traditional warrior skills with knowledge borrowed from shamanic traditions or magical practices, learned through contact with the children. The children faced their own internal divisions as their society struggled to respond to a crisis that their ancient wisdom seemed powerless to address. The green seers who had guided their people for millennia found their counsel increasingly questioned by younger children who advocated for more direct action against threats they could sense but not fully understand. Some children argued for deeper withdrawal into their remaining strongholds, believing that the disturbances in the northern regions would eventually stabilize if left undisturbed. They pointed to their people's long experience with natural cycles, suggesting that patience and careful observation would reveal the underlying patterns governing these apparently chaotic changes. Others pushed for immediate intervention, insisting that something was actively working to destabilize the natural order and would continue its destructive activities unless directly confronted. This faction included the most powerful among their remaining Greaseers, individuals whose visions had shown them glimpses of the intelligence behind the spreading zones of silence and cold. The debate between these approaches reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of their responsibility to the world they had long protected. Were they guardians whose duty required active defense against any threat to natural balance, or were they stewards whose role involved accepting changes they couldn't control while protecting what remained within their power to preserve? Meanwhile, in the deepest caves beneath the far north, things that had slept since the world was young began to stir in response to the magical energies released during the children's creation of their ultimate guardians. The others weren't the only ancient powers awakening to the changing world. Their presence seemed to activate older intelligences, beings whose existence predated both human and children civilizations, entities that had their own understanding of how the world should be ordered. Archaeological evidence from this period shows signs of construction activities in regions where no known civilization possessed the technology or resources for such projects. Massive stone structures appeared overnight in locations that should have been impossible to access, built according to architectural principles that human or children's knowledge couldn't explain. These weren't ruins from some forgotten empire, but new constructions that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. The purpose of these structures remained unclear, but their effects on local weather patterns and magical phenomena suggested they served functions related to the broader changes affecting the northern regions. Some appeared to amplify the zones of silence and cold, while others seemed designed to channel or direct the strange energies flowing from the lands of Always Winter towards specific targets further south. Both the children and the first men began to understand that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple magical accident or natural disaster. The creation of the others had triggered a cascade of changes that reached into aspects of reality neither people had previously known existed. They faced not just new enemies, but a fundamental alteration in how magic itself functioned, how the boundaries between life and death operated, how the basic forces that maintained the world's stability interacted with each other. The Age of Heroes emerged from this realization. When traditional approaches proved inadequate for addressing threats beyond normal understanding, both peoples needed individuals capable of operating outside established limitations. Heroes who could work with forces they didn't fully comprehend because someone had to, and no one else was willing or able to pay the prices that such work demanded. The first settlements to fall completely silent were the northernmost trading posts, small communities that served as waypoints for hunters and trappers, working the edge regions between civilized lands and the true wilderness. These places didn't burn or show signs of battle, they simply emptied, as if their inhabitants had walked away from their daily lives and never returned. Initial search parties found these settlements exactly as their residents had left them. Meals sat half-finished on wooden tables, their contents neither spoiled nor preserved, but somehow suspended in the exact state they had been when abandoned. Tools lay scattered around unfinished projects, as though craftsmen had simply stopped working mid-task and wandered off without explanation. Hearth fires continued burning with no one to tend them, their flames consuming fuel that should have been exhausted days earlier. The most disturbing discovery was the complete absence of bodies, both human and animal. No graves, no signs of disease or violence, no indication that death had come to these places. The people and their livestock had simply vanished, leaving behind a silence so profound that rescue parties reported difficulty hearing their own voices, as if the very air absorbed sound more thoroughly than nature should allow. Those brave enough to spend nights in these abandoned settlements brought back accounts of experiences that defied rational explanation. They described hearing conversations conducted in empty rooms, glimpsing figures moving through peripheral vision that vanished when looked at directly, sensing the presence of crowds in spaces that stood completely vacant. The settlements weren't truly empty. Something remained, but it existed in forms that living senses couldn't quite perceive. Worse still, prolonged exposure to these places began affecting the search parties themselves. Men who stayed too long reported feeling disconnected from their own bodies, as if their consciousness was slowly separating from physical form. They experienced memories of events they had never witnessed, heard voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize, but somehow understood, felt drawn to venture further north into regions where winter never ended. The children of the forest faced similar phenomena in their own territories, though their magical senses allowed them to perceive details that remained hidden from human observers. Their green seers could see the pale threads of influence spreading southward from the abandoned areas, tendrils of something that wasn't quite energy and wasn't quite consciousness, but shared properties of both. These threads followed specific patterns, avoiding certain types of stone and metal while being attracted to others. They seemed particularly drawn to iron, especially weapons and tools that had seen recent use in violence. Swords that had tasted blood, axes used to cut down weirwood trees, spear points that had pierced human flesh, all became conduits through which the northern influence could extend its reach into previously unaffected regions. The implications terrified both peoples. The others weren't simply moving south through conventional travel. They were transforming the very fabric of reality in the regions they touched, creating conditions that allowed their influence to spread through connection rather than proximity. Every blade that had drawn blood became a potential anchor point for their expansion, every act of violence a doorway through which their power could flow. Ancient texts recovered from this period, written in scripts that combined human runes with children's tree writing, described desperate attempts to understand and counter this spreading influence. Joint expeditions ventured into the affected areas, teams composed of human warriors and children's magic users working together to map the extent of the contamination and develop countermeasures. These expeditions discovered that the others weren't operating randomly. Their expansion followed specific geographical and magical principles, creating a pattern that suggested both intelligence and long-term planning. They prioritized areas with particular types of stone formations, seemed drawn to locations where the boundary between the material and spiritual worlds grew thin, showed special interest in sites where significant amounts of blood had been shed during the war between children and first men. Most importantly, the expeditions learned that the others could be resisted, but only through techniques that combined human courage with children's knowledge in ways that had never been attempted before. Weapons forged from dragonglass, also known as obsidian, could disrupt their manifestations. Barriers created through specific combinations of iron, salt, and weirwood could slow their advance. Ritual practices that joined human blood with children's magic could create temporary sanctuaries where their influence couldn't penetrate. But these countermeasures required cooperation between peoples who had recently been trying to exterminate each other. Human smiths needed to learn techniques from children who understood how to shape volcanic glass into weapons sharp enough to cut through supernatural armor. Children magic workers required protection from human warriors while they performed rituals in locations where their enemies might attack without warning. The process of developing these joint techniques created the first true alliances between specific human clans and children communities. These weren't the formal diplomatic arrangements that would later be enshrined in the pact, but intimate working relationships forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. Human families began incorporating children's blood magic into their protective rites, while children communities adopted human organizational structures that allowed for rapid response to emerging threats. These alliances also produced the first children born from unions between the two peoples, individuals who inherited capabilities from both bloodlines. These hybrid offspring demonstrated abilities that neither parent species possessed alone. They could use green sight to perceive threats across vast distances, but also possessed human adaptability that allowed them to function in regions where pure children couldn't survive. They understood both human courage and children's patience, could work with iron weapons and weirwood magic with equal facility. The emergence of these hybrid individuals represented hope for both peoples, but also highlighted how desperate their situation had become. Traditional children lived for centuries, reproducing slowly and maintaining their culture through long continuity. Traditional humans lived brief, intense lives, adapting quickly to changing conditions but losing knowledge across generations. The hybrids combined the best qualities of both approaches, but their existence also meant that both parent cultures were changing in fundamental ways. Archaeological evidence from this period shows signs of rapid technological advancement as both peoples adapted their traditional approaches to meet unprecedented challenges. Human bronze working techniques improved dramatically, producing alloys stronger and sharper than anything created during the earlier war. Children's woodworking evolved to incorporate metals and stones in ways their culture had previously avoided, creating composite tools that served both practical and magical functions. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of new forms of leadership among both peoples. Traditional authority structures, based on age and wisdom among the children or strength and cunning among humans, proved inadequate for dealing with threats that operated according to completely alien principles. New leaders arose based on their ability to work with supernatural forces without being overwhelmed by them. Individuals who could maintain their sanity and purpose while operating in regions where reality itself became unreliable. These weren't necessarily the strongest warriors or wisest elders, but people who possessed some quality of mental flexibility or spiritual resilience that allowed them to function effectively in environments that drove others to madness or despair. Among the first men, this new type of leader often came from the younger generation, individuals whose minds hadn't become fixed in traditional patterns of thinking and who could adapt more easily to magical techniques borrowed from the children. Among the children, leadership shifted toward those who combined ancient wisdom with willingness to experiment with dangerous new approaches to magic and warfare. Both peoples began developing oral traditions that preserved knowledge about fighting supernatural enemies, techniques that would need to be passed down through generations because everyone understood that this threat wouldn't be permanently resolved through any single victory. These traditions included specific genealogies that tracked bloodlines capable of working with particular types of magic, detailed geographical knowledge about regions where supernatural activity was strongest, and complex ritual practices that required precise execution to remain effective. The stage was set for the emergence of legendary figures who would define the age of heroes. These individuals would need to combine all the innovations developed during this period of crisis, working with hybrid bloodlines and joint magical techniques, leading alliances between former enemies against threats that challenged the fundamental nature of existence itself. They would be heroes not because they won glorious victories, but because they found ways to preserve hope when extinction seemed inevitable. The truth came from an unexpected source. Deep beneath Bloodraven's cave, in chambers that existed before the three-eyed crow chose that ancient weirwood as his throne, archaeologists discovered murals that had been sealed behind collapsed stone for 8 millennia. These weren't the crude paintings typically found in such sites, but sophisticated artistic works that depicted events with documentary precision. The images told a story that shattered every comfortable assumption about the nature of the long night. They showed children of the forest gathered in a sacred grove, their hands pressed against the pale bark of a massive heart tree whose trunk was wider than any castle tower. But these children weren't performing some peaceful ritual. They were dying, their life force flowing through their palms into the tree's root system, their bodies withering as their essence merged with something vast and hungry that waited in the earth below. More disturbing still were the figures that emerged from this sacrifice. The murals depicted beings of impossible beauty and terrible purpose, creatures that combined the elegant features of the children with something entirely alien. Their eyes burned with cold fire, their skin held the translucent quality of winter ice, and their very presence seemed to drain warmth and color from everything around them. These were the others, and the paintings made their origin unmistakably clear. The children of the forest had created their own destroyers. This revelation recontextualized everything that scholars thought they understood about the ancient conflict between magic and mundane existence. The others weren't some primordial evil that had always lurked beyond the edges of civilization. They weren't demons summoned from another realm, or gods fallen from grace. They were weapons, crafted through desperate magic by a people who saw no other way to save their world from human destruction. The process had required unprecedented sacrifice. Entire generations of the most powerful grain seers had willingly surrendered their lives to fuel the working, pouring their consciousness into magical matrices that could support beings existing partially outside normal reality. The children hadn't just created the others' physical forms, but had imbued them with aspects of their own racial memory, their understanding of the world's deep patterns, their absolute commitment to preserving the natural order against any threat. But creation, even magical creation, never produces exactly what its makers intend. The others inherited the children's love of the natural world, but filtered through consciousness that existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. They understood the children's desire to preserve ancient ways, but interpreted preservation through the lens of beings who experienced time as mortals experience space. To the others, the solution to conflict between different forms of life was elegantly simple. End all change. Stop all growth. Transform the chaotic, painful, beautiful complexity of existence into something perfect and eternal and still. No more wars between species, no more destruction of sacred places, no more death because nothing would remain alive to die. The children realized their mistake almost immediately, but by then it was far too late. The others possessed their own will, their own understanding of right and wrong, their own vision of how the world should be ordered. They had been created to be guardians of nature, and they would fulfill that function according to their own definition of what guardianship meant. The first children to oppose their creation were transformed rather than killed, their warm blood turned to ice, their living flesh preserved in crystalline perfection. The others offered them eternal existence free from the pain of change, the possibility of watching over the forests they loved until the stars burned out and the universe itself grew cold. Many accepted this gift willingly, seeing it as the ultimate expression of their duty to the natural world. Those who refused found themselves facing enemies who understood their every strategy, who could predict their movements because they shared the same racial memories, who possessed all the magical knowledge of their creators, enhanced by perspectives that transcended mortal limitations. The war that followed was less a conflict than a systematic conversion process, as the others methodically transformed or eliminated every children community that refused to accept their vision of perfect stillness. The surviving children faced a choice that would define the rest of their history. They could continue fighting their own creation, a battle they had no realistic hope of winning, or they could seek allies among the very people they had been trying to drive from their lands. The decision required abandoning not just their territorial claims, but their fundamental understanding of their place in the world. For thousands of years, the children had seen themselves as the world's rightful guardians, beings whose long lives and deep magical knowledge made them natural protectors of the natural order. Accepting human help meant acknowledging that guardianship might require cooperation with forces they couldn't control, that wisdom might come from sources they didn't respect, that survival itself might depend on compromising principles they had considered absolute. The humans they approached for alliance were themselves desperate and confused, struggling to understand threats that operated according to completely alien principles. But they possessed qualities that the children needed. Human adaptability allowed rapid development of new weapons and tactics. Human courage enabled them to fight enemies that paralyzed more thoughtful beings with existential dread. Human ignorance of magical principles sometimes led to innovations that deeper knowledge would have dismissed as impossible. Most importantly, humans possessed something that the others found difficult to transform or control. Their brief, intense lives created a type of consciousness that existed too quickly and chaotically for beings accustomed to thinking in terms of geological timescales. Human emotions burned too brightly. Human thoughts moved too rapidly. Human souls anchored themselves too firmly to physical existence for easy conversion to the other's crystalline perfection. The alliance that formed between the surviving children and human communities wasn't based on mutual respect or shared values. It emerged from naked necessity, two peoples who had been trying to exterminate each other, discovering that their survival depended on cooperation against enemies neither could face alone. This cooperation required both sides to abandon cherished assumptions about their own nature and destiny. The children had to accept that their vision of a world preserved in natural purity was no longer achievable, that survival meant working with people whose values and methods they fundamentally disagreed with. The humans had to acknowledge that their expansion across Westeros would be limited by factors beyond their control, that their descendants would inherit responsibilities and constraints they had never chosen. But perhaps the most difficult adjustment involved accepting that the conflict with the others couldn't be resolved through total victory by either side. The others were too powerful to be completely destroyed, too integrated into the world's magical structure to be safely eliminated. At the same time, they were too alien in their thinking to be reasoned with or converted to more moderate positions. The only viable solution involved containment rather than conquest. The development of barriers and weapons that could limit the other's expansion without triggering escalations that might lead to the extinction of all warm life on the continent. This approach required long-term thinking that neither the children nor humans were naturally inclined towards, strategic patience that went against every instinct driving both peoples. The heroes who emerged during this period succeeded not because they found ways to defeat the others, but because they developed methods for living with a permanent existential threat. They built walls and forged weapons, established bloodlines, and created institutions, developed technologies and magical techniques that could be maintained across generations regardless of changing political circumstances or cultural evolution. Their heroism lay not in winning impossible battles, but in accepting impossible responsibilities. They chose to burden their descendants with duties that might last until the end of the world, obligations that would require constant vigilance and periodic sacrifice from people who had no direct experience with the dangers these precautions were meant to address. The Age of Heroes wasn't an age of triumph over evil, but an age of accommodation with forces beyond good and evil. The greatest figures of this period weren't conquerors who imposed their will on hostile environments, but translators who found ways to negotiate between different forms of existence, builders who created structures that could endure across timescales no human lifetime could encompass. This understanding changes everything about how we interpret the legends that followed. The great deeds attributed to these figures weren't expressions of individual power or divine favor, but achievements made possible through cooperation with forces that remained fundamentally alien and dangerous. Every castle built, every bloodline established, every oath sworn represented a commitment to maintaining balances that could be disrupted through ignorance or negligence, leading to consequences that would affect not just the immediate community, but potentially all life on the continent. The others hadn't been defeated. They had been temporarily contained, held back by barriers and agreements that required constant maintenance from people who might never understand why such vigilance was necessary. The price of that containment was eternal responsibility, passed down through bloodlines that couldn't escape their inherited duties without dooming everyone who came after them. The last hero's true journey began not with a quest for glory, but with a message that came through dreams. Night after night, the same vision haunted his sleep, a vast cavern carved from ice that never melted, where ancient figures sat in council around a heart tree whose roots descended deeper than human understanding could follow. And at the center of that impossible space, a voice that spoke without words, offering knowledge that could save or damn everything he held dear. His 12 companions weren't chosen for their warrior skills or noble bloodlines. They were selected because each possessed some fragment of the hybrid knowledge that had become essential for survival in a world where the normal rules no longer applied. One carried the blood of both children and first men, able to speak with weirwood trees and forge weapons from dragon glass. Another had been born during a winter that lasted 3 years. His body adapted to cold that would kill ordinary humans in minutes. The woman among them had survived being touched by one of the others, an encounter that should have transformed her into one of their crystal servants, but instead left her with the ability to sense their presence across vast distances. The wildling tracker could read signs invisible to civilized eyes, could distinguish between natural winter and the unnatural cold that preceded supernatural incursions. Each member of the group represented a different aspect of the terrible knowledge that humanity was accumulating about enemies that operated according to principles beyond normal comprehension. Their journey north took them through landscapes that defied rational explanation. Forests where the trees grew downward from the sky, their roots spreading through empty air while their branches burrowed deep into frozen earth. Rivers that flowed backward carrying ice upstream towards springs that bubbled with water, warm enough to melt stone. Mountain ranges that shifted position overnight, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look upon directly. But the most disturbing discoveries came from the settlements they encountered along the way. Communities that should have been abandoned stood fully populated, their inhabitants going about daily routines with mechanical precision. Men tended fields where nothing would grow. Women wove cloth from threads that dissolved at human touch. Children played games that involved no movement or sound or joy. These weren't whites in the traditional sense. They possessed too much awareness, too much of their original personalities intact. They could recognize the travelers, could speak their names and recall shared memories from before their transformation. But something fundamental had been altered in their consciousness, some quality of warmth or spontaneity or hope that made the difference between existence and life. The transformed community served a purpose in the other's expanding domain. They maintained the physical infrastructure that the crystal beings needed to extend their influence southward, crafting tools and weapons that could channel supernatural cold, constructing waypoints and supply depots that allowed the other's forces to operate in regions too warm for their natural comfort. More importantly, they served as interpreters between the others and the living world. The crystal beings thought in patterns too alien for warm-blooded consciousness to understand directly, but their transformed servants retained enough human awareness to translate those thoughts into actions that achieved practical results in the material realm. The Last Heroes group learned to avoid these communities, not because they were dangerous in conventional terms, but because prolonged contact with the transformed inhabitants began affecting the living members of the expedition. Exposure to their mechanical contentment, their absolute certainty that conflict and struggle were unnecessary evils that could be eliminated through proper understanding, slowly eroded the psychological defenses that protected warm consciousness from conversion. The deeper north they traveled, the more reality itself seemed to bend toward the other's vision of perfect order. Time moved differently, sometimes rushing forward so rapidly that seasons changed in hours, sometimes slowing to a crawl that made each footstep feel like an eternity. Space folded in ways that meant walking in a straight line could lead to the same location approached from multiple directions, while attempting to retrace their steps might take them to places none of them had ever seen before. Navigation became a matter of following principles rather than landmarks. The group learned to move toward areas where their breath still formed visible clouds, where metal tools still felt cold to the touch, where their own emotional responses remained vivid and unpredictable. These signs indicated regions where the normal rules of existence retained enough strength to support warm life, though even these safe zones grew smaller and more isolated the further north they ventured. The others themselves remained largely invisible throughout most of the journey, but their presence could be felt in subtle alterations to the landscape and atmosphere. Shadows that fell at impossible angles, suggesting light sources that existed outside normal reality. Sounds that carried across distances without losing clarity, as if the air itself had become a more efficient conductor of vibration. Scents that triggered memories of events that had never happened, emotions that belonged to no personal experience. When the group finally encountered the others directly, the meeting took place not on any battlefield but in a space that existed partially outside normal reality, a cavern where ice and stone and living wood had been shaped into something that served as both fortress and temple and throne room for beings whose authority transcended any earthly power. The others weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They possessed a terrible beauty, a perfection of form that made mortal flesh seem clumsy and crude by comparison. Their voices harmonized with frequencies that existed beyond the normal range of human hearing, creating music that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the deepest levels of consciousness. They offered the last hero and his companions the same gift they had given to everyone else who had entered their domain. Transformation into beings of crystal and eternal cold, existence free from the pain of change and loss and mortality. They explained, through means that transcended language, that this was the only form of life that could survive the coming transformation of the world, the only way to preserve anything of human consciousness and culture for the ages that would follow. The offer wasn't made from malice or conquest, but from something that might have been compassion filtered through consciousness so alien that its expressions of care became indistinguishable from threats. The others genuinely believed they were offering salvation, providing the only possible escape from the suffering and chaos that seemed to define warm existence. But the last hero had not come north to accept salvation. He had come to understand the nature of the threat his people faced, to learn whether accommodation might be possible, to discover what price might purchase a reprieve from the advancing cold. His response to the others' offer would determine not just the fate of his own expedition, but the future of every warm-blooded creature on the continent. The knowledge he gained during that encounter couldn't be preserved in written form, couldn't be passed down through normal teaching methods. It existed in forms too dangerous for ordinary minds to contain, too volatile for safe transmission through conventional means. Instead, it had to be encoded in bloodlines, woven into the genetic structure of families whose descendants would carry fragments of terrible wisdom without understanding what they possessed until circumstances forced that knowledge to manifest. This was why certain houses developed their peculiar traditions, their strange customs that seemed arbitrary but served crucial protective functions. The Starks' insistence on personal execution of death sentences wasn't about honor or duty, but about maintaining bloodline connection to the power needed to wield ice, their ancestral sword forged from Valyrian steel. The ritual reminded each generation that they carried responsibility for decisions that might affect the survival of everyone under their protection. Similarly, the Night's Watch tradition of speaking their oaths before heart trees wasn't simple ceremony, but necessary magic, binding that connected human will to the weirwood network that monitored the wall's integrity. The words themselves mattered less than the intention behind them, the conscious acceptance of responsibility that activated protective forces built into the wall's fundamental structure. Every great house developed analogous traditions, customs that seemed quaint or symbolic, but actually served as activation mechanisms for capabilities their founders had built into bloodlines and strongholds. These weren't superstitions maintained through ignorance, but practical techniques preserved through cultural evolution, methods for accessing powers that required generational continuity to function properly. The last hero returned south carrying knowledge that would save the world, but at a price that would burden his descendants for thousands of years. He understood how to contain the others, but containment required constant vigilance from people who would never experience direct contact with the threats they were sworn to guard against. He knew how to preserve warm life, but preservation demanded sacrifices from every generation, obligations that couldn't be abandoned without triggering consequences that would affect the entire continent. The Age of Heroes began with his return, as that terrible knowledge spread among the bloodlines capable of bearing its weight. But heroism, in this context, meant accepting burdens rather than achieving victories, choosing responsibility over glory, committing descendants to duties they could never fully explain to people who would never understand why such vigilance remained necessary. Lan de Clever never intended to become a legend. Born to a family of traveling merchants who traded between the scattered settlements of the western coast, he possessed an ordinary man's ordinary ambitions. He wanted security for his children, prosperity for his clan, and perhaps enough gold to live comfortably, without constantly worrying about bandits or famine, or the dozen other disasters that could destroy a family's fortune overnight. But the world during the Age of Heroes didn't reward ordinary ambitions. The supernatural crisis spreading south from the far north had disrupted every established pattern of trade and politics, creating opportunities for those clever enough to exploit chaos while destroying those who clung to familiar routines. Lan's merchant background had taught him to recognize when circumstances were changing faster than traditional authorities could adapt, and he possessed the flexibility to capitalize on situations that left others paralyzed by uncertainty. The Castellis, who controlled the great rock that would later bear their name, had ruled that region for generations through conventional strength and noble bloodline. They possessed the largest army in the western lands, commanded loyalty from dozens of lesser houses, and sat atop gold mines that funded their dominance over trade routes and political alliances. By every traditional measure of power, they should have been able to weather the crisis better than smaller, weaker families. But traditional measures of power meant little when the very nature of reality was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The Castelli's gold couldn't purchase protection against enemies that had no interest in wealth or earthly ambitions. Their armies were useless against threats that could convert living soldiers into crystalline servants with a touch. Their noble bloodline provided no immunity to influences that operated through supernatural rather than political channels. Lan understood something that the Castellis and other established powers hadn't yet grasped. The crisis required new forms of leadership, individuals who could work with magical forces without being overwhelmed by them, who could adapt to rapidly changing circumstances without losing sight of long-term survival needs. Most importantly, it required leaders who understood that the old boundaries between different types of knowledge were breaking down, that survival might depend on combining practical skills with supernatural awareness in ways that previous generations would have considered impossible or blasphemous. His infiltration of Casterly Rock didn't rely on military might or political maneuvering, but on abilities he had developed through necessity during his family's trading expeditions into regions affected by supernatural influences. He could move through the rock's passages without triggering the magical alarms that the Casterlys had never known existed, could navigate by senses that operated beyond normal human perception, could blend his consciousness with the stone itself in ways that made him nearly invisible to conventional observation methods. The Casterlys had inherited their stronghold without understanding its true nature. Like many of the great fortresses built during this period, Casterly Rock incorporated magical principles that its inhabitants took for granted without comprehending their function. The endless tunnels and chambers weren't simply the result of extensive mining operations, but formed patterns that channeled and contained supernatural forces, creating a defensive network that operated according to principles borrowed from Children of the Forest earth magic. Lan's greatest achievement wasn't tricking the Casterlys out of their birthright through clever schemes, but recognizing the rock's true potential and learning to work with powers that its previous owners had ignored. He understood that the gold mines were only the most visible aspect of the fortress's value, that the real treasure lay in its function as an anchor point for magical forces that could be directed toward continental defense against supernatural threats. Garth the Green faced similar challenges in the southern regions, where the collapse of natural seasons had turned the most fertile lands in Westeros into a patchwork of abundance and desolation that shifted without predictable pattern. Traditional farming methods failed when winter could arrive overnight in the middle of harvest season, when spring might last 3 days before giving way to autumn, when the same field might experience all 4 seasons simultaneously in different sections. His legendary status came not from any single miraculous deed, but from his systematic development of agricultural techniques that could function regardless of supernatural interference with natural cycles. He learned to work with plant varieties that had been modified through children's magic to survive impossible conditions, created crop rotation systems that could adapt to constantly changing seasonal patterns, developed irrigation and soil management methods that remained effective even when the underlying magical climate shifted unpredictably. More importantly, Garth established the first successful cooperation between human farmers and the surviving children communities, creating agricultural centers that combined human labor and innovation with children's deep understanding of plant growth and soil fertility. These partnerships required both sides to abandon traditional approaches that had worked for thousands of years, developing new techniques that neither people could have created independently. The bloodline he established carried genetic modifications that allowed his descendants to sense changes in magical climate before they manifested physically, giving them crucial advantages in agricultural planning and resource management. House Gardner's success in the Reach wasn't based on superior farming knowledge alone, but on inherited abilities that let them work with forces that remained invisible to other agricultural communities. Doran Godsgrief confronted different but equally challenging circumstances in the eastern coastal regions, where the supernatural crisis had triggered massive storms that seemed to possess intelligence and purpose. These weren't natural weather phenomena, but manifestations of something that used wind and rain and lightning as extensions of its consciousness, targeting specific locations and individuals with precision that no ordinary storm could achieve. Traditional fortification methods proved useless against enemies that could manifest inside any structure, that could reshape themselves to flow through gaps too small for normal matter, that could maintain coherent form while existing partially in dimensions beyond normal 3-dimensional space. Durin's achievement lay in developing construction techniques that combined human engineering with supernatural principles, creating barriers that could exclude entities regardless of their ability to manipulate physical matter. Storm's End became the prototype for a new generation of defensive architecture, structures that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions and could maintain their integrity even when attacked by forces that operated outside conventional physics. The techniques Durin developed influenced the construction of other great castles during this period, contributing to defensive networks that stretched across the continent and remained functional long after their builders were forgotten. The Grey King's accomplishments in the Iron Islands required understanding of yet another aspect of the supernatural crisis. The changes affecting the northern mainland had also disrupted the magical currents that flowed beneath the ocean, creating conditions where sea creatures of enormous size and impossible capabilities began emerging from depths that no human had ever explored. His legendary battle with Naga the Sea Dragon wasn't a conventional combat between man and monster, but a complex magical working that required the Grey King to merge his consciousness temporarily with oceanic forces that predated human civilization. The victory allowed him to establish authority over supernatural sea currents that affected weather patterns and tidal movements across the known world, giving his descendants influence over maritime conditions that extended far beyond the Iron Islands themselves. Simeon Star Eyes represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of heroism during this period. Blinded during an early encounter with the others, he developed enhanced perception that allowed him to navigate by senses unavailable to ordinary humans. His sapphire eyes weren't decorative prosthetics, but magical constructs that let him see through supernatural concealment, detect hidden threats, and recognize the true nature of enemies that appeared ordinary to normal vision. But these abilities came at a cost that extended beyond his physical blindness. The magic that enhanced his perception also separated him from normal human emotional connections, leaving him able to function as a guardian and protector, but unable to experience the simple pleasures and relationships that made life worth protecting. His heroism lay in accepting this isolation, choosing to sacrifice not just his sight but his humanity for the sake of people who could never understand what he had given up for their benefit. Each of these legendary figures succeeded through their willingness to work with supernatural forces that others feared or rejected, to develop new combinations of human capability and magical power, to accept personal costs that no reasonable person would consider acceptable. They became heroes not through conquest or glory, but through their ability to serve as bridges between different forms of existence, translators who could communicate between human need and magical possibility. Their achievements created the foundation for institutions and bloodlines that would maintain continental defenses across thousands of years, but the knowledge they gained could never be safely shared with the general population. Instead, it had to be encoded in family traditions, architectural principles, and cultural practices that would preserve essential functions while hiding their true purpose from those who might be tempted to use such power for personal advantage rather than collective survival. 7,000 years before Aegon's conquest, the age of individual heroes began its transformation into something more systematic and enduring. The great deeds of legendary figures had purchased time and knowledge, but survival required more than periodic interventions by exceptional individuals. The continent needed institutions that could maintain defenses across generations, bloodlines that would carry essential knowledge even when its importance was forgotten, and structures that could function effectively regardless of changing political circumstances. The Winged Knight's ascension to power in the Vale represented a new model of heroic leadership, one that emphasized building lasting foundations rather than achieving spectacular victories. His legendary taming of the giant falcons wasn't a demonstration of personal prowess, but the establishment of an early warning system that could monitor supernatural activity across the eastern regions. These magnificent birds possessed senses that operated beyond normal perception, allowing them to detect the approach of others or their influence from distances that would give human communities crucial time to prepare defenses. But the falcons required more than simple domestication. They needed handlers who could communicate with them through methods that transcended ordinary animal training, riders who could share their enhanced perception without being overwhelmed by sensory input that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. The winged knight developed techniques that allowed selected individuals to merge temporarily with falcon awareness, experiencing flight and enhanced vision while maintaining human reasoning and decision-making capacity. These techniques became the foundation for House Aaron's special relationship with the birds of prey that nested in the Erie's impossible heights. Each generation produced individuals capable of working with the falcons, not as mere mounts, but as extensions of human consciousness, creating a surveillance network that stretched across the Vale and into the neighboring regions where supernatural threats might first manifest. House Dane's emergence in the far south involved different but equally significant innovations in the ongoing struggle against supernatural enemies. The falling star that brought dawn to their desert lands wasn't simply a convenient source of superior metal, but a fragment of something that existed partially outside normal reality, material that retained properties from its journey through spaces where the other's influence couldn't reach. The sword forged from this celestial metal possessed capabilities that went beyond exceptional sharpness or durability. Dawn could cut through supernatural defenses that turned aside conventional weapons, could disrupt magical workings that protected otherworldly enemies, could channel forms of energy that existed independently of the wielder's personal strength or skill. But these capabilities required bloodlines modified to handle such forces safely, genetics altered through careful breeding with individuals who carried the right combination of human adaptability and magical sensitivity. The establishment of House Dane as Sword of the Morning represented more than the founding of another noble family. It created a hereditary position dedicated to maintaining readiness for threats that might not manifest for centuries, ensuring that each generation would produce at least one individual capable of wielding Dawn effectively when circumstances demanded its use. This pattern repeated across the continent, as the surviving heroes recognized that their personal achievements meant nothing unless they could be institutionalized and preserved. The great bloodlines that emerged during this period weren't simply successful families that accumulated power and wealth, but genetic experiments designed to produce individuals capable of specific functions in a continental defense network. Each house developed its own specialized role based on the particular supernatural threats most common in their region, and the unique capabilities their founders had discovered or developed. House Stark's authority in the north stemmed from their connection to the Weirwood network and their ability to communicate with the children of the forest's remnant communities. House Lannister's wealth served the practical function of funding defensive preparations that required resources beyond what any single region could provide. House Hightower's construction of their massive tower created the first of what would become a series of beacon stations, structures capable of transmitting warnings across vast distances through magical means that operated independently of weather conditions or supernatural interference. The lighthouse effect that made the tower visible from great distances was only the most obvious aspect of its function. More importantly, it served as an anchor point for communication networks that connected all the major defensive installations across the southern regions. The maesters who later established the citadel in Old Town inherited fragments of knowledge from this period, though they systematically suppressed or misinterpreted the magical aspects of what they preserved. Their campaign against supernatural knowledge wasn't motivated by simple skepticism, but by recognition that such information was too dangerous for widespread distribution. The techniques developed during the Age of Heroes required specific bloodlines and careful training to use safely, and attempts to democratize magical knowledge typically resulted in disasters that affected entire communities. But the most significant development during this transitional period was the gradual recognition that the supernatural crisis couldn't be resolved through any conceivable victory. The others weren't enemies that could be defeated and forgotten, but a permanent feature of the world's magical ecology, beings whose existence served functions that went beyond human understanding or approval. The Great Compact that emerged from this realization involved more than territorial agreements or military alliances. It established principles for managing eternal conflict, methods for containing rather than eliminating threats that were too powerful and too integral to the world's functioning to be safely destroyed. This compact required sacrifice from every participating bloodline, obligations that would bind their descendants for as long as the world endured. Some houses accepted responsibility for maintaining physical barriers against supernatural incursions. Others committed to preserving knowledge that might prove crucial during future crises. Still others agreed to produce individuals capable of wielding specific weapons or working with particular magical forces when circumstances demanded such interventions. The Night's Watch emerged from this period as perhaps the most visible symbol of the new approach to heroism. Rather than celebrating individual achievement or personal glory, the Watch represented collective commitment to duties that offered no reward beyond the knowledge that essential work was being done. The oaths spoken by new brothers weren't just ceremonial words but binding commitments that connected human will to the magical forces that maintained the wall's integrity. Each phrase in those oaths activated specific aspects of the wall's defensive capabilities, creating personal connections between individual brothers and the vast magical working that kept the others contained beyond its boundaries. The tradition of taking no wives and holding no lands wasn't arbitrary asceticism but practical necessity, ensuring that brothers would remain focused on their duties without the divided loyalties that might compromise their effectiveness during supernatural emergencies. Similar oaths bound members of other houses to their hereditary responsibilities, though most of these commitments operated through family traditions and cultural expectations rather than formal ceremonies. The Starks' dedication to personal justice, the Lannisters' accumulation of wealth and influence, the Arryns' maintenance of their aerial surveillance network all served functions that went beyond personal ambition or regional politics. The transition from the Age of Heroes to more conventional historical periods didn't represent the end of supernatural threats or the elimination of magical defenses. Instead, it marked a successful institutionalization of methods for managing eternal vigilance, the establishment of systems that could function effectively even when their operators didn't fully understand their purpose. The heroes of this era achieved immortality, not through songs or stories, but through the creation of institutions that would outlast any individual lifetime, bloodlines that would carry forward essential capabilities across dozens of generations, and traditions that would preserve crucial knowledge even during periods when its importance was forgotten or misunderstood. The battle for the dawn wasn't fought the way the songs describe it. There were no gleaming armies clashing beneath banners that snapped in heroic winds, no single combat between champions while their forces cheered from the sidelines. The final confrontation between the living and the others took place in a realm where conventional concepts of warfare held no meaning, where victory and defeat existed as states of consciousness rather than military outcomes. Brandon the Builder stood at the center of the greatest magical working ever attempted by human hands. But he didn't stand alone. Around him gathered representatives of every surviving bloodline that had proven capable of working with supernatural forces, children of the forest whose life essence would fuel the great binding, and hybrid offspring whose mixed heritage allowed them to serve as bridges between different forms of existence. The wall they built together wasn't simply a barrier of ice and stone. It was a living entity, a conscious construct that drew its awareness from the combined will of everyone who participated in its creation. Every block of ice carried memories of the people who shaped it. Every foundation stone held fragments of consciousness from those who placed it. Every mile of its length contained the essence of individuals who chose to become part of something larger and more enduring than any human lifetime. But the true revelation about the battle for the dawn lies not in how the wall was built, but in what it was built to contain. The others weren't driven back beyond its boundaries through superior force or clever tactics. They were offered something they valued more than conquest, something that satisfied their alien understanding of what the world should become. The last hero's negotiations with the others had revealed their fundamental nature as beings created to preserve the natural world against any form of change or corruption. They weren't evil in human terms, but they operated according to principles so different from warm life that their salvation was indistinguishable from extinction for everything they claimed to protect. The compact reached between humanity and the others didn't involve victory by either side, but accommodation that recognized the eternal nature of their conflict. The others would be permitted to maintain their perfect frozen realm beyond the wall, a place where time stood still and change never disturbed the crystalline perfection they sought to impose on all existence. In exchange, they would refrain from extending that realm southward, allowing warm life to continue its chaotic, painful, beautiful dance of growth and decay and renewal. But this accommodation required guarantees that neither side could provide through simple promises or treaties. The others existed outside normal time and couldn't be bound by agreements that depended on political continuity or cultural memory. Humans lived brief lives and might forget the importance of maintaining barriers they had never seen tested by necessity. The solution required creation of binding mechanisms that operated independently of conscious choice or cultural continuity, systems that would maintain themselves across any conceivable span of time, regardless of changing circumstances or evolving understanding. The wall became more than a physical barrier. It became a magical contract written in ice and stone and human essence, a living document that would enforce its own terms through methods that transcended politics or military might. The Night's Watch emerged as the human component of this eternal agreement, but their true function went far beyond the simple guardianship described in their traditional oaths. Each brother who joined the Watch became part of the wall itself, his life force contributing to the magical working that maintained the barrier's integrity. The prohibition against marriage and inheritance wasn't monastic asceticism, but practical necessity, ensuring that brothers would have no divided loyalties when the wall required their complete commitment. The most closely guarded secret of the Watch, known only to a handful of Lord Commanders throughout its history, involved the nature of what happened to brothers who died while serving. Their consciousness didn't simply fade away, but became incorporated into the wall's collective awareness, their memories and knowledge preserved in ice that never melted, their vigilance continuing long after their physical bodies had returned to Earth. This revelation explains why certain Lord Commanders could make decisions that seemed to require impossible knowledge of threats and circumstances they had never personally encountered. They weren't operating through individual wisdom alone, but drawing upon the accumulated experience of every brother who had ever served, accessing memories that stretched back to the wall's original construction and the heroes who shaped its fundamental nature. The dragon glass weapons and Valyrian steel that proved effective against the others weren't simply superior metallurgy or superior craftsmanship. They were created through techniques that incorporated the same principles used in the wall's construction, methods that allowed physical matter to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions and affect beings whose nature transcended normal reality. Dragonglass, formed through volcanic processes that occurred at the intersection of multiple elemental forces, possessed natural properties that disrupted the other's crystalline perfection. But its effectiveness required more than simple contact. The weapons had to be wielded by individuals whose bloodlines carried genetic modifications developed during the Age of Heroes, people whose consciousness could extend into the dimensional spaces where the other's true forms existed. Valyrian steel represented an even more sophisticated approach to the same challenge. The techniques used in its forging incorporated human metallurgy with children's magic and knowledge gained from direct contact with the others themselves. Each blade carried within its structure tiny fragments of the same forces that maintained the wall, making every Valyrian sword a miniature version of the Great Barrier, a portable piece of the compact that bound the supernatural realm to respect certain boundaries. But perhaps the most profound revelation about the battle for the Dawn involves understanding what the heroes of that age chose to sacrifice for their victory. They didn't simply risk their lives in battle or accept the hardships of defending civilization against external threats. They agreed to transform the fundamental nature of human existence, accepting limitations and obligations that would bind their species for as long as the world endured. The great bloodlines that emerged from this period carried genetic modifications that made them capable of working with supernatural forces, but those same modifications came with costs that affected every aspect of their descendants' lives. Some families developed sensitivity to magical influences that made normal existence painful or impossible. Others acquired enhanced lifespans that left them watching everyone they loved age and die while they remained unchanged. Still others gained abilities that required constant vigilance to prevent accidentally harming those around them. The institutional structures created during the Age of Heroes, from the Night's Watch to the great houses to the various orders and traditions that maintained magical defenses, all operated according to principles that prioritized collective survival over individual happiness or freedom. The heroes who established these systems understood that warm life could continue only if certain boundaries were never crossed, certain knowledge never shared, certain prices paid by every generation regardless of whether they understood the reasons for such sacrifices. This understanding casts the entire history of Westeros in a different light. Every major political event, every dynastic struggle, every war and alliance and betrayal that shaped the Seven Kingdoms occurred within constraints established by the Age of Heroes, boundaries that couldn't be safely crossed without triggering consequences that would affect not just the immediate participants, but potentially all life on the continent. The others hadn't been defeated. They had been accommodated, their hunger for perfect stillness satisfied through the creation of a realm beyond the wall where they could pursue their vision of crystalline eternity without interference from the chaotic energies of warm life. But that accommodation remained stable only as long as the living world maintained its part of the ancient compact, only as long as the institutions and bloodlines and traditions established during the Age of Heroes continued to function according to their original design. The true climax of the Age of Heroes wasn't a moment of triumph but a moment of acceptance, the recognition that heroism sometimes requires not victory over enemies but peaceful coexistence with forces that can never be fully understood or completely trusted. The greatest heroes of that age were those who chose responsibility over glory, who accepted burdens that would affect their descendants for thousands of years, who built systems designed to outlast any individual lifetime or dynastic ambition. Their legacy lives on, not in the songs sung about their deeds, but in the quiet effectiveness of institutions that continue to protect the realm from threats that most people never see or understand, in bloodlines that still produce individuals capable of working with forces beyond normal human comprehension, in traditions that preserve essential knowledge even when its importance is forgotten by those who maintain them. The Age of Heroes didn't end with a decisive battle or a grand treaty ceremony. It faded gradually, as the emergency measures developed during the supernatural crisis became the normal structure of civilization, as the extraordinary individuals who had bridged the gap between human and magical understanding were replaced by institutions designed to preserve their achievements across generations that would never directly experience the threats their ancestors had faced. This transition created one of history's great paradoxes. The more successful the heroic defenses became, the less their descendants understood the reasons for maintaining them. Each generation grew further removed from the original crisis, more inclined to interpret ancient obligations as outdated traditions or superstitious practices that interfered with modern progress and rational governance. The maesters who established themselves as keepers of knowledge during this period faced an impossible choice. They could preserve the complete truth about supernatural threats and magical defenses, risking the disaster that would follow if such dangerous information fell into the wrong hands, or they could edit and suppress the most crucial details, ensuring safer ignorance, but potentially leaving future generations unprepared for threats that might return. They chose a middle path that satisfied neither complete honesty nor complete concealment. Official histories preserved enough truth to maintain basic institutional functions while obscuring the magical principles that made those functions necessary. The Night's Watch continued to guard the wall, but most brothers understood their duty in terms of defending against wildling raids rather than containing otherworldly horrors. The great houses maintained their traditional responsibilities, but interpreted them through frameworks of political necessity rather than supernatural obligation. This compromise worked for thousands of years because the defenses established during the Age of Heroes proved remarkably effective. The wall held against incursions that never materialized in forms that ordinary people could recognize. The ancient bloodlines continued to produce individuals capable of working with magical forces even when they didn't understand the nature of their own abilities. The institutional structures maintained themselves through cultural momentum that operated independently of conscious understanding. But the seeds of future crisis were planted in this very success. As generations passed without direct supernatural threats, the skills and knowledge necessary for recognizing and responding to such dangers gradually atrophied. Bloodlines that carried essential genetic modifications were diluted through marriages with families that lacked the right heritage. Traditional practices that served crucial protective functions were abandoned as unnecessary anachronisms. More dangerously, the suppression of accurate information about the original crisis created gaps in understanding that left later generations vulnerable to manipulation by forces that retained complete knowledge of the ancient compact. The children of the forest's surviving communities preserved detailed records of everything that had occurred during the Age of Heroes, including information about weaknesses in human defenses that could be exploited under the right circumstances. The three-eyed raven emerged from this period as perhaps the most significant guardian of complete knowledge about the supernatural crisis and its resolution. Neither fully human nor entirely other, but something that combined aspects of both forms of consciousness. This entity maintained awareness of the ancient compact while working to ensure that its terms continued to be honored by all parties. But the three-eyed raven's guardianship came with its own costs and limitations. Operating through Greensight and the Weirwood network, this consciousness could observe events across vast distances and time spans, but couldn't intervene directly without violating the same principles that kept the others contained beyond the wall. Any action that disrupted the carefully maintained balance might trigger escalations that could lead to the collapse of the entire defensive system. This constraint meant that future crises would require the emergence of new heroes, individuals capable of working with supernatural forces while remaining sufficiently human to make choices that purely magical consciousness couldn't risk. The bloodlines preserved from the original Age of Heroes served as reservoirs for such potential, genetic pools that could produce the right combinations of human adaptability and magical sensitivity when circumstances demanded their activation. The cyclical nature of these requirements explains why certain prophecies and predictions emerged during the later stages of the Age of Heroes. Individuals with access to complete knowledge of the supernatural compact could foresee circumstances that would require new heroic interventions, situations where the institutional defenses established by their predecessors would prove insufficient to address emerging threats. The prince that was promised, Azor Ahai reborn, the various other prophetic figures described in ancient texts, all represented attempts to prepare for future situations where the careful balance maintained since the original crisis might be disrupted by forces that the Age of Heroes defenses couldn't address. These prophecies weren't supernatural predictions in the mystical sense, but practical contingency planning by individuals who understood the long-term dynamics of the magical forces that shaped their world. The dragon's return to the world, after centuries of absence, represented one such contingency activation, a response to changes in the fundamental magical climate that required rebalancing of forces that had remained stable for thousands of years. Dragons weren't simply powerful military weapons, but living embodiments of the fire magic that served as counterweight to the ice magic that the others represented. Their bond with specific bloodlines wasn't accidental, but represented activation of genetic modifications preserved from the Age of Heroes, traits that had remained dormant until circumstances required their expression. The Targaryen connection to dragons reflected not just political alliance or cultural tradition, but biological compatibility developed through careful breeding programs established by individuals who understood the eventual necessity for such partnerships. Similarly, the various magical abilities that began manifesting more frequently during the later historical periods represented not new developments, but the awakening of capabilities that had been deliberately incorporated into human genetics during the Age of Heroes. Warging, green sight, resistance to fire, enhanced longevity, and other seemingly supernatural traits were actually the expression of modifications made by ancient heroes who understood that their descendants would need such abilities when the time came to renew or renegotiate the compact that kept the world's most dangerous forces in balance. The true resolution of the Age of Heroes lay not in the ending of supernatural threats, but in the creation of systems capable of managing such threats across time spans that exceeded any individual or institutional lifespan. The heroes of that age succeeded by building defenses that could function independently of complete understanding, that could maintain themselves through cultural evolution and genetic inheritance, that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential functions. Their greatest achievement was transforming heroism itself from an individual quality possessed by exceptional people into an institutional capability that could be maintained by ordinary individuals working within extraordinary systems. The Night's Watch, the great houses, the various orders and traditions that preserved magical knowledge, all served as mechanisms for producing heroic responses to supernatural challenges without requiring each generation to rediscover the principles and techniques developed by their predecessors. This institutionalization of heroism created its own form of immortality for the individuals who established it. Brandon the Builder lives on not just in the wall that bears his legacy, but in every brother who serves the Watch, every Stark who accepts responsibility for defending the North, every person whose life is protected by barriers that function according to principles he helped develop. His consciousness became part of the collective awareness that maintains the ancient compact, his will incorporated into systems that will endure until the world itself changes beyond recognition. The same pattern applies to all the legendary figures from that era. Their individual achievements were remarkable, but their lasting impact came through their success at creating institutions that could preserve and extend their capabilities across unlimited time. They became heroes not just through their personal deeds, but through their vision of heroism as a sustainable system rather than a collection of individual exploits. The Age of Heroes ended when this transition was complete, when the emergency measures developed during the crisis had become the permanent structure of civilization, when the exceptional individuals who bridged human and magical understanding had been replaced by institutions capable of maintaining that bridge across any conceivable span of future time. Their legacy continues in every person who benefits from defenses they never see, who lives safely because of vigilance they never understand, who inherits capabilities they may never need to use, but which remain available when circumstances require their activation. The snow falls gently now over the ancient battlefields of the north, each flake a whisper of memory settling into the silence that cradles forgotten deeds. Beneath this pristine blanket lie the bones of heroes whose names were never recorded in songs, whose sacrifices ensured that others could live ordinary lives filled with ordinary joys and sorrows. The wind carries no echoes of their final moments, no trace of the prices they paid for the peace that followed. In the Godswood at Winterfell, the heart tree stands as it has for 8,000 years, its carved face watching over the realm, with eyes that have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of legends, the endless cycle of courage that each generation must discover anew. The red sap that weeps from its ancient bark carries within it the memory of oaths sworn in desperation, promises kept through duty rather than glory, choices made by people who understood that some burdens cannot be shared or explained. The children who play beneath its branches know nothing of the supernatural forces their ancestors battled, nothing of the magical compacts that still protect their daily games from threats beyond imagination. They chase each other through dappled shadows, while the carved face watches benevolently, its expression holding both sorrow for what was lost and satisfaction for what was preserved. This ignorance isn't failure but triumph, proof that the Age of Heroes achieved its deepest purpose. Beyond the wall, the aurora borealis dances across the northern sky, in patterns that speak to those who remember the old languages, messages written in light that confirm the ancient compact remains unbroken. The others move through their crystalline realm, with the patience of beings for whom time has no meaning, content to pursue their vision of perfect stillness in lands where summer never comes. Their satisfaction with this arrangement has become part of the world's natural rhythm, as reliable as the turning of seasons in the southern lands. The Night's Watch maintains its vigil at Castle Black, though most brothers understand their duty in simpler terms now. They patrol the wall's length and train with weapons they may never need to use in anger, unaware that their very presence maintains magical barriers that function through will and sacrifice rather than steel and stone. Their oaths bind them not just to human loyalties, but to forces that transcend individual understanding, making each brother part of a collective consciousness that spans centuries and connects the living with the honored dead. In the crypts beneath Winterfell, the Stone Kings sleep with iron swords across their knees, their carved features weathered by age, but still recognizable as the faces of men who bore impossible burdens with quiet dignity. The swords they hold were never meant to be drawn in battle, but serve as keys to chambers deeper still, where the true treasures of House Stark wait for circumstances that may never arise. Their rest is peaceful because their vigilance continues through descendants who carry forward their purpose without fully comprehending its scope. The great houses that emerged from the Age of Heroes have spread across the Seven Kingdoms, their bloodlines diluted by thousands of years of marriages and political alliances, yet still producing individuals who dream strange dreams and wake with knowledge they cannot explain. A Lannister child glimpses gold veins in rock walls that should hold no precious metal. A young Arryn feels the air currents shift hours before storms arrive. A Stark boy hears whispers in the wind that speak of dangers approaching from directions no map can show. These gifts manifest rarely now, emerging only when necessity awakens capabilities that lie dormant in bloodlines preserved across countless generations. Most who experience such moments dismiss them as imagination or coincidence, never understanding that they carry within themselves fragments of the heroic legacy that shaped their world. The ignorance protects them, allows them to live normal lives unburdened by responsibilities they never chose and powers they could not safely wield. The maesters in their citadel continue their careful curation of knowledge, adding new links to chains, while quietly removing others that might prove too dangerous for general circulation. Their great library contains volumes that will never be copied, texts whose bindings grow more brittle with each passing year, taking with them secrets that perhaps should not survive into future ages. This selective forgetting serves the same protective function as the selective remembering practiced by the great houses. In the gardens of Highgarden, roses bloom in colors that exist nowhere else in the known world, their beauty enhanced by soil enriched with the essence of sacrifices made so long ago that their nature has become part of the natural cycle. The gardeners who tend these flowers work with techniques passed down through generations, unaware that their methods incorporate principles borrowed from the children of the forest, magic so subtle it appears indistinguishable from exceptional skill. The Iron Islands echo with the songs of waves breaking against ancient bones, the rhythm unchanged since the Grey King first claimed dominion over these waters. The sound carries messages for those who know how to listen, confirmation that the old agreements remain in force, that the boundaries established during the Age of Heroes continue to hold against pressures that would otherwise reshape the world according to alien logic. Ravens fly between the castles of great lords, carrying messages written in ink on parchment, unaware that they follow routes established by creatures who understood communication networks that operated through dimensions beyond physical space. Their flights maintain connections that serve purposes greater than any individual correspondence, keeping active a web of awareness that spans the continent and links every major population center to systems of mutual defense. The people of Westeros go about their daily lives blessed by protections they never see. Their ordinary struggles with harvest and weather, love and loss, ambition and disappointment, all made possible by barriers that keep at bay forces which would end such beautiful complexity in favor of crystalline perfection. They argue over inheritance laws and trade agreements, while walking on ground hallowed by heroes who ensured such arguments could continue across countless generations. This is the true victory of the Age of Heroes, not the defeat of ancient enemies, but the preservation of the right to live without constant awareness of cosmic threats, not the elimination of supernatural dangers, but the creation of systems so effective that people can afford to forget why they were necessary. Not the conquest of forces beyond human understanding, but the patient work of building accommodations that allow different forms of existence to coexist without mutual annihilation. The Age of Heroes continues in every act of quiet courage, every moment when someone chooses duty over convenience, every decision to protect others at personal cost. It lives in the Night's Watch brother who patrols the wall on cold nights when nothing threatens but tradition demands vigilance. It endures in the Lord who upholds ancient customs without understanding their purpose, in the mother who teaches her children stories whose deeper meanings have been forgotten, but whose essential truths remain vital. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, know that you rest under the protection of heroes whose greatest achievement was making heroism unnecessary for those who came after them. Their watch continues in forms too subtle to disturb your dreams, their legacy preserved in institutions too stable to require your conscious maintenance, their love expressed through vigilance that asks nothing in return save the peaceful continuation of all the small precious things that make life worth protecting. The snow continues falling gently over the ancient battlefields, covering the scars of old conflicts with beauty that speaks of healing and renewal. In this silence, legends rest content, having transformed themselves into something greater than individual glory. They have become the very foundation upon which ordinary people build extraordinary lives, the invisible guardians of every dawn, the eternal protectors of hope itself.